my friend got back to me on Orlando Robinson, the new Sacramento Kings center / forward. Because I'm of the mind that sometimes you just got to ask a fan. And what do they think? You get the vibe. If a team makes a trade, if the Kings acquired a player in a trade, and the opposing fan base is like, thank God that guy's gone, you don't feel great about it.
No.
You don't feel very good about it. But when they acquired DeMar DeRozan in a trade and the other fan base is like, dang, like, tough to see Lamar or DeMar go, then you feel a little better about it. So I wanted to test this with Orlando Robinson. So I text my friend David, who is a diehard Miami Heat fan, diehard Miami sports fan. Watches 82 games a year, watches every minute of every game. I said, thoughts on Orlando Robinson? Here's what he said. He's definitely a basketball player. That's what he said.
That's it?
That was the first thing he said.
That's a scouting report? Oh, there's more.
Then he said, nah, but for real. He was just surplus for requirements. Once the Heat drafted Khalil Ware, good back end of the roster big.
Okay.
Which is about what we said. So we were spot on.
Yeah, there's no guarantee that he's gonna
Do we even know what the contract looks like yet?
We don't know what the contract looks like.
Okay.
So I'm gonna guess there's not a guarantee, but like a huge guarantee. The Kings are up against it. So I was looking this morning, and they're without him. I think they're like 167.6 million, right, in salary for this season, dedicated salary. So 167.6. $167,640,684 to be exact. When you add Orlando Robinson, you're gonna take on, because he's got more than 2 years. He is a third year guy. Either way, he's only going to count 2.087 million against your cap. So, but that puts the Kings up at 169 million. And almost 169,700,000. Well, the luxury tax is like 170.7 million. So you only have like another million, which means you don't really have enough for like a full-fledged other player. You might have enough for a league minimum rookie scale player, and that's it.
Yeah.
So, if they're going to hit the luxury tax. Now, again, you don't have to worry about the luxury tax till the end of the season, but for today, that's where you're at. And a lot of things can change between now and the end of the season. But it kind of puts you up against it,
right?
Because you can't bring in a 15th player and give them a bunch of guaranteed money or full guaranteed money without going over the luxury tax as of today. Okay. Now, down the road, you might be able to do some other things and clear some space to drop back below. But if you're a team that is worried about the luxury tax, and again, we talked about this the other day, you go $1 million over the luxury tax, you owe the league $1 million for that, and you lose out on the $12 million for being under the cap. So it costs you like $13 million plus the $1 million that the player salary cost you. So you're looking at like $14 million. You go $5 million over the cap. That costs you $5 million for a player, $5 million for luxury tax. That's 10. And it costs you another $12 million because you don't get the luxury tax money. So you're looking at $22 million to go $5 million over the cap. So these are all to go $5 million over the luxury tax. So they're all things that you have to keep in mind when you're looking at the Kings' salary for the season. But again, you can always try to make a trade where, you don't take back as much money as you're sending out. Yeah. And maybe you can do a lopsided trade that actually helps you.
Well, yeah. And if you're going to be doing that, you have to be competing for a title. You have to feel really good about your chances to do that.
I think you don't have to be competing for a title, but if there's a move that's out there that's going to cost you 10, 15, 20 million, but you're closer to it better be the move that solidifies you where you are or raises your value in the playoffs. If you're not a playoff team, you're not going to be able to make that move right then, I believe, that puts you back into the playoff picture. Maybe there's some move, but the Kings, this is part of advanced team building. And once you get to this stage, we talk about who their core is and all that, and you know who the core is. But if you want to add to the peripheral of the core, it's going to cost money. And
Right.
yeah, and so we're also talking that the Kings still have access to their non taxpayer mid level at 12.8, but if they're already hard capped, so they don't have access to all of the money. They can only go up to 178 million or whatever it is now because they did a sign and trade. But they do have trade exceptions. So
let's pause on this.
Yeah.
What is a trade exception?
Okay, so when like trades are considered two different things in the NBA. One is called a simultaneous trade, and one is called a non-simultaneous trade. So let's just say you have two players and they both have the same amount of salary going in and out. So two $18 million players. You send, so that's a trade that's over and done with right there. It's done. There is no more trade to it. So that's basically a simultaneous trade. Now there's these others that are non-simultaneous trades where you can trade. Let's say you send out two $6 million players and you take back a $4.5 million player. So when you do this play, like a $6 million player and a $6.4 million player, let's just say that those are looked at as two separate trades. So in effect, you actually traded a $6 million player for a $4.7 million player, and it creates an exception for the dollar. It's basically a coupon for the amount that was over. And then the other player you can get a full-fledged like exception. It's called a trade exception for $6.3 million. And I bring this up because this is exactly what happened with Toronto when the Kings traded Davion Mitchell and Sasha Vezenkov. They created an exception at $6.3 million. So as opposed to having Sasha Vezenkov on your roster still, or having him buy out and then go somewhere else, but again, your cap space dissolves because you wouldn't have any cap space there. What you did do is you created this little exception where he goes to Toronto. They were able to buy him out and send him packing. But at the same time, if the Kings would have just had him leave, it would have dropped them lower on the salary cap, but they wouldn't have this exception that they can go out and trade. They can take back a player or two players into an exception that doesn't go over that $6.3 million. They can't combine it with another trade. Although you can combine it in a different non-simultaneous trade. So you can have a deal where, again, you have multiple pieces going to multiple places, right? And you can use an exception to absorb a player into your contract, into your salary, because you have an exception. The Kings also created another trade exception.
So real quick.
Yes.
So the trade exception, let's say the Kings are at the cap, the exact number.
Yep.
But this trade exception allows them to trade to bring in 16.3 while 10 goes out?
No. A trade exception, what they can do with a trade exception is that they can find a team that has a $6 million player and they can absorb that player into their salary without sending anything out. So it's literally basically just like a coupon for $6.3 million in salary cap, like a holder, like a placeholder. So and that's why they call it a non-simultaneous trade, because you can have a trade that happens later that's still part of the original trade, because that trade exception is basically part of the previous trade exception.
Okay.
Yeah. So as of right now, the Kings could go out and find a $6 million player and absorb him into their salary, go above the salary cap, take him in without giving anything away, and it's legal within the rules of the salary cap because they have this exception.
So if some team is like, hey, we need to get below the first apron and we're $5 million over, here's this $6 million player, they can just give him to the Kings.
Yeah, they can give him to the Kings. And
with the trade exception.
On the reverse side, it creates the trade exception for the other team now, because they didn't send anything out. They sent something out, but didn't take anything back.
That's where the value lies in that.
Yes.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
even if the Kings are hard capped and they are at whatever, I'm going to say 150. I know it's more than that, but just to have a placeholder, they're hard capped at 150 and they're at 150.
Yep.
They can still absorb that 6.3.
No. Now, because you're hard capped, you can't do that. But the fact is, the Kings are at 169 million. They're hard capped at 178.
Got
So
it.
you have this buffer
Yes.
in
Yes.
between where
Got it.
you can absorb more players. Now they have other
Got it.
options to
Okay.
do this too. Trade exceptions are good for 1 year from the date of the trade.
Okay.
So you can use this all the way up until the first, week. Well, the Sasha Vezenkov trade happened at the end of
Second day of the draft.
It did, but it happened before the 2024-25 NBA season started. So one is you can use after the draft, but before free agency. And then when they did the DeMar DeRozan trade,
Mm-hmm.
they shipped Chris Duarte to Chicago, but didn't take anything back from Chicago. So they created another one of these trade exceptions for almost 5.9 million.
And those can't be.
They cannot be aggregated.
Yeah.
They cannot be stacked. They can't be added to each other. And it's very dicey when if you go to do like a bigger trade in aggregate. But again, it can come into play where if you have a third team
Mm-hmm.
that's involved in a 3-team trade,
Mm-hmm.
you can do what basically Chicago just did, where they took on Chris Duarte and gave nothing away, and the Kings created another trade exception.
Mm-hmm.
So that could happen in reverse. Like, so if the Kings were trying to go out and get a big deal done, there's a way in which they could hand out a trade exception to cover part of their expense.
Got it. Jeez.
Yeah, a little wild, right?
Insane.
That's
totally insane.
That's why I love the salary cap, because it's not just so basic. It's like super complex, and in order to be like, you can think whatever you want about Monty McNair, whatever you want about Wes Wilcox.
Mhm.
They're both very, very intelligent men.
Yeah, you have to be.
I mean, these are very, very high level thinkers, and they have to consider all of this. They also probably have like a guy who's there that does their salary cap stuff. It used to be Ken Catanella, who was spectacular at the 2-year deal with third-year option. Like that was Ken Catanella special. He had all of these option years and stuff. Like the current group, they handle their business a little different, but you can see how their thinking is if you really pull back and you look at like when a contract expires. You have Kevin Huerter for 2 more years. The day that Kevin Huerter's contract expires is realistically the day that Keegan Murray's contract jumps from $9 million to 20 whatever million dollars. So there's all of these mechanisms in place where you're trying to build a team, but you have to think about today. You have to think about how much money you can spend in this free agent world. You got to think about whether you can go out and bring a player in using a trade exception or not. You got to worry about this whole thing about the luxury tax, and then you got to worry about being hard capped. You have to balance all of these things.
Yeah, it's understanding the butterfly effect of your move.
Yes.
It's okay. Here's move A, but that's not just Kevin Huerter and X for Kyle Kuzma.
Yeah.
Okay, great. But what are the dominoes that then fall? And that gets us to place X. Okay, but here's move B. And the dominoes that fall, that gets us to place Y.
Yes.
And you're really assessing the X, Y, and Z versus the A, B, and C. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So like realistically, when the Kings they had an opportunity maybe to go out and get Brandon Ingram, right? But Brandon Ingram makes $36 million, right? You had 2 players in Kevin Huerter and Harrison Barnes that equaled like 35 million. It's almost a perfect swap, right? But the other thing you have to think about is that those 2 players that you have, they're under contract for 2 years. So it's basically a wash. You're trading 2 players that equal 35 million for 1 player that's 35 million, 36 million. But if you were to resign Ingram and keep it around that dollar amount, basically it's a net neutral trade, right? So you're not blowing up your cap long term because you gave up these 2 pieces that were under contract for this year and next year. So the next 2 years, it's a total net neutral trade. That's now that you don't have Harrison Barnes to trade in that, it becomes a lot more complex.
Right.
Because if you take a Kevin Huerter, 17 million, 8 million of Trey Lyles, that's 25 million. Add in, if you wait 60 days, add in Jalen McDaniels, Now that's another 4.5 million. You're at almost 30 million.
Yeah.
You're trading 3 and you're taking back an additional $6 million. And so it's impossible to backfill. It's not impossible, but you're going to have to pay the tax.
Yeah.
He also puts you over the tax already, going from, because you're adding $6 million extra in salary. So you have to look at these things like every move that you make impacts the next move.
Yeah.
And it's why Lauri Markkanen is talked about so much. And it's why Kyle Kuzma is talked about so much, because their salaries are, again, Lauri Markkanen makes $18 million. You could trade him straight up for Kevin Huerter, and it's basically a net neutral trade. Now they're not doing that,
Right.
but you have to, that's what the dynamics of that. So right now that's fine. But then when you have to go pay him next year and he makes 30, say he wants 40, you got to come up with another way to, like, that $24 million difference in what you traded and what now the player that you have, it becomes a lot more complex. Where a guy like Kyle Kuzma, 23.5, 21.5, 19.5, locked in over 3 years, you know exactly how much you're paying him, and you can build your salary structure around it, just like you can DeMar DeRozan, just like you can De'Aaron Fox and Domantas Sabonis, just like you can Malik Monk. You just lock Malik Monk up for 3 years, 4 years with the third year with a player option, but you understand exactly how much he's going to cost you and how you can build the rest of your salary structure.
I feel so vindicated on Brandon Ingram, by the way. I feel so good about how this went. I feel bad for him. Feel terrible for him. I hope he gets maxed out. But when all that discussion was going on, I'm just not a big Brandon Ingram guy.
Okay.
And I haven't been. I feel like it's the idea of Brandon Ingram versus the practicality of Brandon Ingram.
Yeah.
And I looked and I went, I don't think I'm maxing that guy. I understand that some teams probably going to. I don't think that's the correct thing. And now the Pelicans don't want to max him, and then they couldn't trade him because nobody wants to max him out.
No one else wants to max it. And that's a problem, right? It's a problem for the team. It's a problem for the player. And like, that's where realistic, like,
well, that's kind of where this is all heading, right?
Yeah.
With the way the aprons are now, or with the existence of the aprons, because now it's like being a luxury tax team is where you're getting into the first and second apron. It hurts a lot more than it did prior to the new CBA.
Yeah.
So maxing out Brandon Ingram now comes with the risk of, hey, maybe he's not that dude. Yeah. But it used to be, but we'll pay to see. And now it's, hey, he might not be that dude. And then we're stuck with this contract, and we're going to have to make all these moves to be below the second apron. And now what's our team look like because we have a maxed out Brandon Ingram and we can't pay anybody else? So I think that's what we're going to start seeing is players in that Brandon Ingram tier of player, where it used to be, yep, max contract. That's just how it is. We're going to see those guys get maxed a lot less.
No, I think you're right. And I also think it's why a guy like Kevin Huerter has tremendous value today and tremendous value in February at the trade deadline.
It's still on the team, by the way.
Well, he is, but you're looking at a player that you can look at as a 3-point shooter and what he brings to the court. You can also look at him as a $17 million like block that you've already committed that money to, and you've already fit into your salary cap, and you've got his money fit in this year, and you got his money fit in next year. So you have a good idea of who he is and what he does, but you can also move that for some other piece that might be different. And, we talked to on D-Lo and Casey yesterday. I talked about this. Like, there are no perfect players to fit in right now for the Kings. I don't believe, but like, this is why you're always looking at, the games missed by Markkanen and by Ingram. The fact that both of those guys miss 20, 25 games a year. You look at Kyle Kuzma and you're worried about, like, how does he fit in with your culture? Does he really want to be there? All that stuff. So you've got him. You got Cam Johnson, who's like, okay, Cam Johnson's a perfectly fine player, but is he an upgrade over, like, even what Harrison Barnes brings? But if you have Cam Johnson, what would that allow Keegan Murray to become? If you have Kyle Kuzma, how much could he stunt the growth of Keegan Murray? Like, there's all of these dynamics that you have to that you have to think about when you're trying to build this out.
Sure.
And it can't just be about, hey, I need to get my team better and I'm going to trade this player for that player and everything's going to be fine. because there comes a point where you can't pay everybody.
Mhm.
And there comes a point where one player can really hurt the growth of another player.
Mhm.
And you have to be cautious of all that stuff.
Yeah. I was so operating on the idea that Kevin Huerter was being moved this offseason, and now we're trying to figure out how he fits into the rotation.
He might get traded tomorrow, and we don't know.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. That's,
Yeah.
Again, like there is an imbalance in this roster, and they know
Mhm.
that.
Mhm.
And that you need to figure out a way to balance it a little bit
Mhm.
better. But that doesn't mean that you're going to go out there and hamstring yourself.
I want to make this clear because I've seen what happens when you write a piece. Um, James is saying that entirely hypothetically,
Yes. Yes.
just to be very, very abundantly clear.
Well, yeah. I mean, the trade, like teams can still trade
Literally any player could get traded tomorrow from any team.
Yeah. There is nothing that says that the Kings are done moving. When you hear things like, "Oh, this is our core, we're building around."
Mhm.
Like who's in the core and who's not. So yeah,
Yeah.
there's plenty of things that can happen still.
No doubt.